Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll continue my conversation about Michel Foucault's What is an Author? This is the third conversation on the same essay. Previously, we have covered how Foucault starts with objections to his own work. Then he gives us these two thematics that were supposed to eradicate the author but have not done so, and I covered that in part 2. And then he moves on to discussing the function of the author. And in today's part, that is the only part of the essay that I'll be covering. What does he mean by author function? How is he articulating that and moving on to discuss it? So in the very beginning of this part, as he moves from his discussion of the death of the author and the void created by it, this is what he declares. It is obviously insufficient to repeat empty slogans. The author has disappeared. God and man died a common death. Rather, we should re-examine the empty space left by the author's disappearance. We should attentively observe along its gaps and fault lines, its new demarcations, and the reapportionment of this void. We should await the fluid functions released by this disappearance. In this context, we can briefly consider the problems that arise in the use of an author's name. What is the name of an author? How does it function? Far from offering a solution, I will attempt to indicate some of the difficulties related to these questions. So, of course, that reference to the death of God is to that of Nietzsche, and the death of man or the author is to Barthes. But I think what Foucault is suggesting in this paragraph simply is that let us not worry about the debates whether or not the author is dead. Let us take it for granted. But the question is, even if we have declared the author dead and the work of art or writing has become non-representational of the authorial intention in so many ways, why is it that we still name the author, right? What constructs the name of the author? That is the more perplexing question. How do we believe in it? How do we come up with it? So that is what he is going to explore, the problematics of filling a void left by the death of the author, still by an authorial identity, and what constitutes it, right? And that's what he discusses in this part. So let us do a little bit longer reading of how he approaches that, and then go to how he concludes the question of the name of the author. The name of an author poses all the problems related to the category of the proper name. Here I am referring to the work of John Searle, among others. Obviously not a pure and simple reference. The proper name, and the author's name as well, has other than indicative functions. It is more than a gesture, a finger pointed at someone. It is, to a certain extent, the equivalent of a description. When we say Aristotle, we are using a word that means one or a series of definite descriptions of the type, the author of the Analytics, or the founder of ontology, and so forth. Furthermore, a proper name has other functions than that of signification. When we discover that Rimbaud has not written La Caisse Spirituelle, we cannot maintain that the meaning of the proper name or this author's name has been altered. The proper name and the name of an author oscillate between the poles of description and designation. And granting that they are linked to what they name, they are not totally determined either by their descriptive or designative functions. Yet, and it is here that the specific difficulties attending an author's name appear, the link between a proper name and the individual being named, and the link between an author's name and that which it names are not isomorphous, and do not function in the same way, and these differences require clarification. To learn, for example, that Pierre Dupont does not have blue eyes, does not live in Paris, and is not a doctor, does not invalidate the fact that the name Pierre Dupont continues to refer to the same person. There has been no modification of the designation that links the name to the person. With the name of an author, however, the problems are far more complex. The disclosure that Shakespeare was not born in the house that tourists now visit would not modify the functioning of the author's name. But if it were proved that he had not written the sonnets that we attribute to him, this would constitute a significant change and affect the manner in which the author's name functions. Moreover, if we establish that Shakespeare wrote Bacon's Organon and that the same author was responsible for both the works of Shakespeare and those of Bacon, we would have introduced a third type of alteration which completely modifies the functioning of the author's name. Consequently, the name of an author is not precisely a proper name among others. These differences indicate that an author's name is not simply an element of speech as a subject, a complement, or an element that could be replaced by a pronoun or other parts of speech. Its presence is functional in that it serves as a means of classification. A name can group together a number of texts and thus differentiate them from others. A name also establishes different forms of relationships among texts. Neither Hermes nor Hippocrates existed in the sense that we can say Balzac existed, but the fact that a number of texts were attached to a single name implies that relationships of homogeneity, filiation, reciprocal explanation, authentication, or of common utilization were established among them. Finally, the author's name characterizes a particular manner of existence of discourse. Discourse that possesses an author's name is not to be immediately consumed and forgotten. Neither is it accorded the momentary attention given to ordinary, fleeting words. Rather, its status and its manner of reception are regulated by the culture in which it circulates. So this entire discussion about the question of the proper name and the authorial name, right, is really important. Because what he's trying to say is that naming, a proper name, has two functions. Descriptive, Masood Raja, it describes me, a person who's like me. And designative, that what my role is. So when we are using a name connected to a work, the name of the author, we are designating that name as an author. Right? So he gives you an example. Now Pierre Dupont is the French version of John Doe. An unknown person, that we could associate a list of works to John Doe and then have in our mind that this person is the author of these texts, right? And it won't matter if that person has blue eyes, red eyes, or whatever, right? But at the same time, let's say we are reading Shakespeare and we find out, oh my God, he didn't live in the house that people think he lived in. His parents' name was different. It still won't matter to us because it might change the descriptive name of Shakespeare. But the designation of Shakespeare as the writer of these sonnets is still sustainable, right? Now that would come to crisis only, that designative naming of the author, if we were to go and prove that someone else wrote these sonnets. And people have claimed that, the anti-Stratfordians, right? Or someone else wrote the Homeric works. At that time, the proper name, even though it is still Shakespeare, will become problematic because it will no longer hold as the authorial name, right? So what is it hinting at? What it's hinting at is that the proper name might be stable, but the authorial name isn't necessarily stable because it is connected to the work that points to the author, or connected works, their affiliations, right? And it is that that holds the name of the author stable. And that is why towards the end of this part of the essay, he will now take us outside the text, beyond the proper name, to the actual discursive practices of naming, right? To the author function itself, right? So most of what I've just read is pretty self-explanatory. I'm just like adding my little insertions here and there. But let's read the final part and then I'll come back and conclude it. We can conclude that unlike a proper name, which moves from the interior of a discourse to the real person outside who produced it, the name of the author remains at the contours of texts, separating one from the other, defining their form and characterizing their mode of existence. It points to the existence of certain groups of discourse and refers to the status of this discourse within a society and culture. The author's name is not a function of a man's civil status, nor is it fictional. It is situated in the breach among the discontinuities which gives rise to new groups of discourse in their singular mode of existence. Consequently, we can say that in our culture the name of an author is a variable that accompanies only certain texts to the exclusion of others. A private letter may have a signatory, but it does not have an author. A contract can have an underwriter, but not an author. And similarly, an anonymous poster attached to a wall may have a writer, but he cannot be an author. In this sense, the function of an author is to characterize the existence, circulation, and operation of certain discourses within a society. So here we are, after we read these brief passages that I just read, we have now figured out why he went into discussing the name of the author and the distinction between the proper name and the authorial name or the name of the author. Because as his examples point out, the proper name within a discourse points to a person outside the discourse, right? This is Masood Raja. This is Michel Foucault. But the authorial name mediates between the text, its contours, and the discourse within which the text is produced, right? It's connected to it, but the text doesn't directly point to it, right? But we take someone as an author of a text within a social discourse. So it is the discursive practices of a given society that teach us to internalize this idea of the name of the author, right? That is what he's trying to highlight, because he will build his argument on that. So by the end of these paragraphs, one thing that has become very clear is that the author is not just a proper name. It's not someone designated. It's someone determined within a given culture through various discourses that determine or designate what the author function is, how to name an author. And that is what is crucial in understanding what is an author. And he will now move on to discuss some of these discourses, right? So keep this thing in mind. So as I pointed out in the previous conversations also, the best way to understand Foucault and Derrida and many other scholars is to read carefully line by line, because as they are arguing a point, they are also building, literally or figuratively, the building blocks of their argument. Each part of the argument seeps into the other. So that is why you have to read it carefully, chronologically, and then recursively to see how does he get there. How does he get from the proper name, the designation function and descriptive function, to the discursive production of the name of the author? And then he goes into discussing those discourses. So that's all I have today, very brief, and I haven't even done much of the explanation. I just wanted to give you chronologically the readings of certain specific passages and why does he discuss the things that he discusses in those. I'll be back with more, probably conclude the whole essay either in the next lecture or in the next 2 lectures. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments, or if you like it, do let me know. I love to hear from you. I hope you all are staying safe, taking care of each other. Please continue to do so, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, peace and love.